So, Dave, do we want to have a little discussion around that? So Dave brought up a little bit about the sermon, specifically about the tendency in some circles to use the Gospel of John as a tool of segregation.
Yeah.
In other words, John 3:16, that people use that to say that the only way to God is through Jesus. So you must believe in Jesus or you're condemned to hell. So part of what I wanted to bring up today was how theologically wrong that is. The Gospel of John is a universal gospel. It's meant to be to the whole world. And of course, that's what happens today. Jesus' hour comes, he says, when the Greeks come to him. And when they come to him, what he's saying has moved past Judaism to the entire world. It's representing the entire world. So the whole point of this gospel, in my mind, is that the covenant is now not between Judaism and God, but between the whole world and God. And that was the whole point of what he was trying to do. So when folks take John 3:16 and do that to it, I will tell you, offended, because that is the opposite of what the Gospel of John, in my mind, is all about. The other thing is, when you read the Gospel of John, it's a continuum. It's an evolving gospel. At the beginning, the people in the gospel have zero to no faith. And then they have a little bit of faith. Nicodemus, John 3:16. He's in the dark. He doesn't get it. He doesn't understand what's happening here. It's only later in the gospel that people start getting it. And it's always women that get it. The men never do get it in the Gospel of John. That's why in the Gospel of John, the story of the money changers that we talked about a couple weeks ago, happens at the beginning of the Gospel of John. But it happens at the end of all the other Gospels. The other Gospels do it in timeline order. John does it to prove to take us on this continuum of growing faith. Okay? So that's what's going on there. So I am a Huston Smith proponent on this. Do you all know Huston Smith? Huston Smith was a world religion teacher who wrote, I think, the very best books on the world religions. And that's what one of his books is called, The World's Religions. He went inside all of the major faith traditions of the world and tried to teach them from the inside out, so that people really understood what the tradition was all about. And Houston's really good. I totally recommend him. He just died a couple years ago. He died at 96. An amazing guy. I had the great privilege of my spiritual director, was a guy named Al Painter. Al went to school with Huston Smith. They both became world religion guys, and they took different paths to get there. My spiritual director became an American Baptist preacher, but then a professor of world religions. And so I got to learn from him too, and that was really, really wonderful. Anyway, what Huston says is, when people ask him this question, which every time I've heard him on radio or TV, somebody always asks, well, what about the Gospel of John? It says you have to believe in Jesus or you're condemned to hell. How can you believe that these other faith traditions are potential for anyone? And he says, okay, who is Jesus in the Gospel of John? And he goes back to the prologue, and he starts reading the prologue to the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In the beginning, all things came from this. And then it goes on to describe Jesus being with God at the beginning of creation, and that this was all one act. So he said, so who is it? Who is Jesus in this gospel? It's the person that was with God in the very beginning. We're talking about the cosmic Christ. We're not talking about just this person, this human being on earth. And he said, I would submit that all of the world's great wisdom traditions believe in some sort of creator. He says, it's the same entity. They might call it something different, but it's the same entity. So that's kind of his approach to this, and That's totally the case. And that's certainly the case with today's gospel.
And my Presbyterian pastor told me that was heresy when I told him that's how I felt.
Oh, yeah.
That all religions, I believe, believed in the same God. They just had different ways.
Yeah. So I am not suggesting that all religions are the same. That in the end we all kind of believe the same thing. We don't. We believe very different things. But in this case, the essence of Christ was according to the Gospel of John here at the beginning of time. So who else can that be except the essence of God? It's also tied to the Greek understanding of Sophia. If you ever want to have some fun, read the Sophia text in Proverbs 8 and then compare them to the prologue in the Gospel of John. What John is saying is that Christ is wisdom personified, the same as the Jews refer to Sophia.
Yeah.
And there is our female connection. Gosh, I wasn't supposed to go with any of those directions. That's fine. Okay, good?
Very
All right,
good.
so we're going to talk about polity today. So let's see. So we need to go not beyond 115, okay? Okay. All right. So polity is how we organize ourselves as a church. And I think we've talked about the fact that the Episcopal Church began after the American government was set up. Approximately 1/2 of the folks that sat down to write the U.S. Constitution in Philadelphia walked down the street and set up the Episcopal Church, like the same week. So they have just formed this new understanding of government in the world. Remember, there are no other governments that are being run by the people and for the people. So that becomes a major part of what the Episcopal Church will be all about. So they tried to build a church based on the same ideas that they had come up with to form the American government. So let's start with the prayer book. You don't all need a prayer book, but you can just grab a couple. We'll read a couple deals here. Who wants a prayer book? Who wants to? Take a prayer book, you have to read. So somebody turn to page 855. And so if somebody, the first question under ministry, could somebody read that?
Who are the ministers of the church?
Yep. And read the answer.
The ministers of the church are laypersons, bishops, priests, and deacons.
Okay. So that is our first deal. The ministers in the Episcopal Church are all of us. First, most important,
Us,
laypersons.
laypersons.
Then bishops, then priests, then deacons. Okay? Lay people are the main ministers of the church. I used to put, in our bulletin, all members ministers, to just remind everybody that that's what we all are. And that became the hallmark of the Episcopal Church compared to other churches. In practice, we're still always trying to envision how this works. There was a bishop in Nevada 20 years ago named Stuart Zabriskie, and Stuart came up with this idea of total ministry, and it was trying to figure out a way how we lived into this thing where all of us were ministers and what that actually looked like. And Stuart especially came up with this plan in Nevada, because there are so many rural parts of Nevada, and there are so many congregations that are all by themselves, and it's really hard to get a priest there. So he came up with this idea of total ministry. Steve Kelsey, our other Steve K here at Grace St. Paul's, knows total ministry totally and completely inside and out, because he's served in lots of places where total ministry was a big deal. So if you want to learn more about this, ask Steve anytime. He'll tell you his experience. He worked in Upper Michigan, Northern Michigan, where total ministry was a really big thing, and on the Navajo reservation, and many other places in the Northeast. And so he knows it really intimately. But the idea was, or Stuart was coming up with ways that lay people could serve in bigger ways. So out of total ministry came the idea of local ordination, where we would ordain somebody to be a priest just for a specific church, who would be what we call a worker priest, for lack of a better word, but they would keep their day job but also become a priest. So all of that came out of this total ministry idea. Okay, so yeah, that's, I don't want to go into a whole bunch on that, but Steve can tell you more if you're interested. So, so let's talk about our word. Remember, we called the church at the beginning the Protestant Episcopal Church in America. Protestant, saying that we believe in what happened in the Reformation. Episcopal, because we wanted to keep the church Catholic in its order of worship and the way we did things. So, does anybody know what Episcopal means? So it's a Greek word. Yep. Yeah. Say it.
Succession of bishops?
You just said it. Bishop. Yep. Yep. It just means bishop or of a bishop. So, so the Episcopal Church is in by the word of a bishop. In the dictionary, if you look it up, it says any of various churches governed by bishops. So the first thing you need to know is that's untrue. Plus, we are not governed by bishops. We have bishops, priests, and deacons, but who's most important? Lay people. We do not make any decision in our church without lay people being involved in the decision. No decision. Okay? We have lay people involved in all of that, and I'm going to show you how that works out. Okay? So we are actually governed by a combination of lay people, bishops, priests, and deacons. The Methodist Church is actually closer to being Episcopal in that way than we are, because their bishops do have authority to assign clergy, so and other things. Bishops have much more authority in the Methodist Church than they do in the Episcopal Church, and you see that mostly. But they move their ministers to various locations regularly, and that's part of the bishop's job.
You came out of the Episcopal Church, didn't you?
Yeah. So next week I'm gonna chart you out how all the churches came together. But the Methodist tradition came out of the Anglican tradition. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about that process of picking clergy or a bishop, and we're doing that now in the church. So that's a good thing. So usually what happens is if it's a church picking a new rector, they appoint a search committee, and at the diocesan level they do the same thing. They appoint a search committee, and then the search committee tries to write a profile about the church or about the diocese in the case of a bishop. And then people apply for the position thinking that their profile matches with the church's profile or with the diocese's profile. We have this electronic matching system that doesn't really work, but it's supposed to be this lovely thing where we match people's profiles together, and then we go out and look. So then after the search committee usually interviews people, and they come down to a group of most often 3 people, and this would be the case for a priest in a church or a bishop, and often there are more candidates for bishop than that, usually 5. And then those candidates are usually presented, in the case of a church, to the vestry, and then the vestry has the final vote on who is going to be the next rector. In the case of a bishop, the search committee comes up with the folks. The potential bishops go around the diocese and get interviewed all over the diocese, and then it goes back to the standing committee of the church, and we're going to talk about what all that means. And then, in the case of a bishop, we vote on the bishop. So this year at diocesan convention, those of you who were lucky enough to get selected for that, you are going to represent the whole church and vote for our next bishop. Don't screw up. So we'll go to convention, and we will sit in houses. We will all the ordained folks will sit in part of the hall, and all the lay people will sit in the other part of the hall, and we will vote for a bishop. So there's usually 5 or 6 candidates. A candidate needs to get over 50% of the vote in both the lay order and the clergy order to get elected. So it's highly unusual for someone to get elected on the first ballot. It usually takes 5 or 6 or 7 or 8. Sometimes it takes, we can't do it at a convention, and we have to come back and do it again because nobody gets the votes. But it's a really amazing process to see that happen. I've been involved in 2 bishop elections. The first one went 6 ballots, and we elected Carolyn Tanner Irish to be Bishop of Utah, the first female bishop west of the Potomac River. That was kind of fun. And then, of course, we're in this process now, and there's a very similar process for a presiding bishop. But I'll go back to that after we fill in all these pieces.
Are the candidates generally from within their diocese?
That's a really good question. Usually they're not.
Can you repeat the
Oh,
question?
that's interesting.
The question was, are candidates for bishop usually already within the diocese? Priests in the diocese already? And the answer is usually not. Usually they come from outside the diocese. That's not always the case, but all of them that I've been involved in, there hasn't been one candidate from inside. But it can happen, and people are encouraged to run for bishop in the diocese. Yeah.
Okay,
Really?
now you said that everybody, I don't know who's there, but can us people go to the convention?
Sure, anybody can go.
Right.
It's
But you
just that
don't
we
have a
have,
vote unless you're,
right.
okay.
Yeah,
It's
so we can go to the convention.
Yep, we have a number of delegates based on the size of our church. We have 5 delegates and we have 5 alternates. So our 5 delegates will get to vote. in
But
the ways.
if I'm not,
You can watch the whole deal.
You can be there and
You
watch.
can be there and watch the whole thing. Everything's open. Yep.
okay, what do you, how do you get tickets?
You don't need tickets. You just show up.
You just
Okay.
show up.
Yep.
First one, first come, first served.
You just show up.
It's in Phoenix?
It's in Phoenix.
Where is it held?
I want to jump just a little ahead for the ordination of the bishop then. Can anybody go to that?
Probably not, because there is no space in Arizona big enough to house that.
No, they
event.
said they have a mega church, and
They-
that probably means 1,000 people at most. So.
Well, yeah, maybe 4,000 or 5,000, but that still wouldn't be enough for everybody in the diocese.
So how do you,
I don't know how they're going to do that yet.
okay.
They said that they think they're going to be able to keep it pretty open, but I don't know what their process is going
Well,
to be.
as a fairly new to this church and getting on in years, I'd love to,
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a lot of us.
Yeah, I'm
that
hoping.
part of it.
Yeah, I'm hoping we can get a lot of folks in because it is a really wonderful thing to see. I will tell you that the process to get there, the voting, it brings tears to my eyes every time I do this. Voting for our bishop. I mean, just the thought of this and everything we do. Cheryl, and then
The diocese is just always by state?
no, that's a good question too. No, dioceses are by region. So it just so happens that in the West, it's usually a whole state. But no, there we have 5 dioceses in California.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, yeah. And even then, the diocese is too, even though those dioceses are too big for one bishop. So I can't remember the exact count, but Diocese of Los Angeles, I believe they have something like 350 churches. So there's no physical way that the bishop could visit every church, even in a couple years. So in cases like that, I'll jump ahead to one of our new words. We have what's called a suffragan bishop. A suffragan bishop is somebody who is an assisting bishop in a diocese when the one bishop can't do it all.
Are there states, like in some of the smaller states back east, where they have...
Where they're combined?
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. So, and it's not just state lines here either. The last church where I served was in Arizona. It was in Page, Arizona, but I was in the Diocese of Utah. And that happened during the last regime here, where all the border places went off, which made sense because Utah has money, because they sold St. Mark's Hospital back 50 years ago.
Huge endowment.
In Salt Lake City. What's that?
Huge endowment.
Yep. So
And most of the churches in
our
Utah
folks.
are not incorporated.
That's right. So it made sense for a church to go in. I spent so much money the first year there because I knew that the church the church had a nice endowment and that we could afford this. And I knew that if I didn't put a face on this place, there was no way it was going to grow. So I'm going to tell you anyway. So I put $30,000 on my personal credit card when I got to St. David's and Page in the first month, just to put this on. And I called up my boss, Dave Bailey, who is now the Bishop of Navajo Land, and said, Dave, so here's what I did. And he said, Keplinger, this better work. You got 90 days to make this happen. So, and unfortunately, in 90 days, our congregation was 5 times what it was this morning.
Oh, my.
And by the time we left, we had a parish of 200 people in this tiny little town of 9,000 people. And we had to build another church. So they spent a whole bunch more money to build this new church. But they were happy then. So. Okay, we're way off topic here. All right, did we get?
I had a question about bishops.
Yep.
So I know that the priesthood is a calling. It's not just, oh wow, I've always wanted to be a priest. I think I'll go be a priest.
Yep.
But it's also a vocation. I mean, you're running a church, you're doing this, you're doing that. It's a job, vocation. So how does that translate over when you're a priest and you, pardon the expression, but have aspirations to be a bishop? Is there a new calling? Did the angel Gabriel visit you in your dream? Or do you just go, is it all, dang, I've always wanted to be a bishop. I already did the calling part, so I'll apply?
Dang, Martha, you go right to it. Don't you?
Yeah. For better or for worse.
So, yeah,
Wouldn't it be the Angel Moroni, though?
The angel,
I only know one angel name, so I stuck that in there.
that's the Mormon.
It's the renegade.
Moroni's the one that's on the top of all the Mormon towns.
Yeah.
Oh, got it.
So yeah, I mean, that is a real issue. There are folks, I will readily admit, there are priests in this church who, from the time they got ordained a deacon, felt like they were called to be a priest. They had aspiration to be a bishop. So they had aspirations for that from the very beginning, and other folks have those aspirations sometime along the line. Ideally, what is supposed to happen is you're a priest, and you fulfilled your ministry in whatever way that you see that it's supposed to be fulfilled, and you really do have a calling to say, I think I'm supposed to be doing something different beyond what I'm doing here, on a different scale. That's how it's supposed to work. But you're absolutely right, it doesn't always work like that. There are people who are on a corporate ladder who believe that they should be a bishop, and that's their aspiration from the beginning. It sucks, but they do. So what I personally have tried to do in this is to help us eliminate this seeing bishops, priests, and deacons on a hierarchical scale. People are called to be deacons. People are called to be priests. People are called to be bishops. People are called to be lay people. It's not a stepping stone, and it is in the Roman Church. It is in the Orthodox Church. It's not supposed to be in our tradition. We're supposed to all be the same. So I've tried really hard to stress that here. We try to uphold the diaconate as a ministry that's just as important as lay people or priests. And that's why the deacons do so many proclamations in our service here at Grace St. Paul's. That doesn't happen at all churches. The deacons have a role to servanthood, and they're called to that, and we try to honor that. Some of us in the church, right now, you have to be ordained a deacon for at least 6 months before you can be ordained a priest. Okay. And I personally think that plays right into what you're saying, Martha, that it looks like a stepping stone thing, and you're moving up the corporate ladder. I have suggested, along with many other folks, that we stop ordaining people deacons to the transitional diaconate at all. That we ordain people a priest, we ordain them a deacon, and that's it. That we just have permanent deacons